All right. I'm going to leave that poll up for just another second, and then while we go over our agenda. All right, so we have a lot of information for you today, and we will have these slides available for you afterwards so that you'll be able to refer back to them. We're just going to do some really quick introductions of our team this morning, and then we'll dive into some information on state resources, some federal resources, and the main event information on the EPA Brownfield grant. And there will be a couple of options throughout the session to ask questions. All right. So as I said, my name is Carrie Staten. I'm with the Western University Technical Assistance to Brownfields program, which is an EPA funded program that we'll talk about shortly. And Christian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Carrie. And I apologize, I'm double booked, but I wanted to come on and say hi to everybody. My name is Christian Abilto. I'm an associate professor at the WVU School of Public Health. So for this project, I am primarily in charge of the evaluation. That's why the poll questions were funny, because I helped design those. So I guess I shouldn't answer them, but really excited about this. My research interest is physical activity in the built environment. So I understand just how important redeveloping unused spaces is and activating them. And personally, this is fun. We were talking beforehand. My father grew up in Delaware in Hockessin, and my wife, he and my wife are both University of Delaware graduates in some capacity, and I've worked there and everything. So it's great to be involved with something that impacts Delaware in a positive way. So looking forward to it. I'll put my email in there if anybody has questions or complaints about any of the poll questions. How about that? I'll take the brunt of those. So we appreciate everybody's participation in that, as it will, in all seriousness, help track what is going on and how well the group is doing things and provide good feedback in real time. So thank you.
Thanks, Christian. All right. And then I mentioned KDC, who is also with the WVU TAB program, and she's going to be kind of in the background today, answering your questions in the chat if you have technical issues, and just providing technical support. So thanks to Katie. And I'll let our speakers introduce themselves as we get going. So first up, we have got some great information for you from the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control.
Good morning. This is Jill Williams Hall. I am the Brownfield Program Administrator for the state of Delaware. But my comment right now is don't get too attached to me, because after 30 years of state service, I will be retiring next Thursday. But the program will continue, and all the information I give you will stay in place. So I'm sure there'll be a great successor to me. So next slide. So in Delaware, we have adopted pretty much the federal definition of what is a brownfield. And we did that in 2019. Before that, we had a definition that said the property needed to be vacant, abandoned, and underutilized. It currently says it has to be expansion, redevelopment, reuse of which is hindered by the reasonably held belief the real property may be contaminated. So let me break that down for you so that we start with what exactly are we talking about when we talk about a brownfield, because I know some people, we call it brownfield with a capital B or brownfield with a small b. When you're talking to DNRAC, we're doing it under this definition. So next slide. So what's the reasonable belief there may be environmental contamination? That's kind of a subjective, reasonable belief. And I've had a lot of discussions when I first took this position 3 years ago with our attorneys as to what that actually means legally. And their answer is, what would a reasonable person believe? So it doesn't mean that there have to be actual samples taken of a property to prove there's contamination. If there's a reasonable belief, which is usually based on the history, it used to be an industrial plant, that meets that criteria. There must also be a plan. It has to be a plan for development, redevelopment, or expansion of that property, that nobody is going to take the property. It's hindered by that reasonable belief. Everybody's standing back and saying, yep, that's a great 4-acre property, but it used to be the ABC industrial plant, and I don't want to have to deal with that. So there is not funding. The one thing in our Brownfield program, if you're converting open space to a developed area, that we don't fund. So next slide. So where can you find a brownfield under that definition? Reasonable belief. Some of them are easy. The top left, an old industrial site, an abandoned gas station, a dry cleaner. Some of the other ones people tend not to think of. One of those there, that's a shooting range. Well, lead shot can lead to lead contamination. The other one, the bottom right, kind of just looks like, oh, a nice wooded area. Well, if it was the old dump site, maybe licensed, maybe not, that can be, again, a brownfield. Reasonable belief that it's contaminated and therefore nobody wants to buy it and develop that property. So again, under the definition, there don't have to be actual samples taken. So you need to keep that in mind when looking at what could be a potential brownfield. Next slide. So who can be what we call a brownfield developer? You'd think of that as the prospective purchaser. So somebody is looking at a piece of property. What criteria do they have to meet for us to give them liability protection and funding? The party that's legally responsible for the contamination or possible contamination on that property cannot be a brownfield developer. So that would be the property owner, or if there was an operator on the site, say it was leased out to someone to run the gas station or the dump site or the landfill, that entity cannot be a brownfield developer. And the reason is they are legally responsible under our statute for the contamination, and we cannot give them liability protection from the statute. There also can't be what we call a contractual or familial relationship between that person who wants to develop the property and the property owner or other responsible party. Contractual, again, if it's the person that leased the property and ran it as a landfill, they leased the site, were the gas station operator, that's a contractual relationship. They can't be the brownfield developer. Familial relationship is just what it says, family. It can't be the son of the property owner, can't come in and be the brownfield developer. The prospective purchaser, brownfield developer, they have to enter into a legal agreement with DNRAC. They have to be willing to sign that. It's a whole lot of legalese and a lot of pieces of paper, but what it breaks down to is it gives the brownfield developer liability protection for that contamination, allows them to have funding from the department. It spells out what they agree to do to get that liability protection and funding, and it spells out what DNRAC agrees to give them in return. Next slide. So I know this is kind of hard to read. This is a very shortened version of how all this happens in the state of Delaware. So essentially, the simple steps to this are, how do you become a brownfield developer or have a property entered in the program? There is an application. There's no fee associated with that application at all. It's on our website. It is not voluminous. It's not onerous. It's a lot of information like names and addresses, tax parcel information. Information goes on that application that completes that reasonable belief there's contamination. So it may be that there have been samples taken of phase 1 or phase 2, that would satisfy that. It also can, in some cases, simply be the history of the site, that this site used to be a landfill, or it used to be a tannery, it used to be a gas station. That would go on the application to meet the criteria in that definition. Then we get the application, we go through, make sure it's completed correctly, that it does meet the definition. Certification letter comes from the department to the brownfield developer. Then we have a legal track, and very often those two tracks are running simultaneously. The next step is the brownfield developer signs that brownfield development agreement. They then are hiring a certified consultant in the state of Delaware, who then interfaces with DNREC to do the sampling plan, to go out, actually do the sampling, give the results to the department. The department reviews those, and from that determines, is there more work to be done? Is there no work that needs to happen? It goes straight to what we call a certificate of completion of remedy. That can take, the whole process can take up to a year, probably total, from the day the application is received, the legal agreement is signed, the consultant does all of their sampling, gets the report to DNREC, we review it and get that information back to the brownfield developer. As for remediation, obviously that's a site-by-site basis and can take varying amounts of time to do actual cleanup or to cap the site or to move soil. In the end, what the developer receives is called a certificate of completion of remedy. And that's going to give them the liability protection for any contamination that was identified as existing on the site the day that they signed that legal agreement with DNREC. So if 5 years after they've completed the project, contamination shows up on their site, or it shows up, something shows up next door, that brownfield developer is not responsible for that contamination. That the state would step in and determine how to take care of that. The brownfield developer in Delaware is also not liable for any contamination that exists beyond the property boundaries. So they are only responsible in that legal agreement they sign with DNREC for investigating and cleaning up what is on the site they are purchasing. So if we should identify that contamination has gone over the property line, again, that is the state's responsibility to step in and either pursue the responsible party, perhaps the state deals with it out of state funding, but it is not the responsibility of the brownfield developer. Next slide. So the big thing, I've threatened to have t-shirts made that have this on them. If a brownfield developer takes title to the property before they sign that legal agreement, they have now become the owner of the property. And under our statute, they are now a responsible party and they're no longer in the Brownfields program. So the big thing to remember in Delaware in terms of timing is that the application is completed, sent to the state, certification letter is sent, and then they sign the BDA. After that point, they can take title to the property. They do not, however, have to. In our program, one of the benefits is, and again, there can be different agreements between the buyer and seller. What DNREC says is you may come in as a brownfield developer, have the property certified, have your eligibility determined for the funding, sign the brownfield development agreement, hire the consultant, do the investigation, have that information come into the department, get the results of that as to what further work needs to be done. The brownfield developer at that point, if they have not yet taken title to the property, DNREC says you may now walk away. You do not owe us any money. We've paid for the investigation. We have the information, and we will make, whatever determinations we need to do as to further work based on that. But as a brownfield developer, you're not required to take title and you're not required to give us any money back. Now, there can be a different agreement between the buyer and seller, and there certainly are sites where the brownfield developer signs the agreement and that afternoon they take title to the property, and that's fine by us, but they do not have to. Next slide. Another in the last few years, because we changed the definition of brownfield, it used to be there could be no operations, business activities on a brownfield site because the definition said vacant, abandoned, underutilized. Since the definition has changed and it is reasonable belief that development, redevelopment, expansions being hindered, there can be operations or business activities under certain conditions, but you must get prior approval. So there can be a site that the property owner currently has a tenant that's doing something, say a used bookstore, and they want that tenant to be able to continue in business while the brownfield investigation is ongoing, because obviously the property owner still has expenses. They're still paying taxes for that property. They can request that that business be allowed to continue in operation. We will review any of those requests that come in and issue permission for that to occur, or if it is an activity that could be exacerbating any environmental situation, it's possible that we say no, or it's possible that we say you can do that, but you must do extra sampling. But the big thing to remember is that there has to be prior written approval from the department. If there's not, and we find activities ongoing, we can rescind our brownfield approval. Next slide. So now the big thing everybody is waiting for, which is the show me the money part. Currently the funding for the Brownfield Development Program for nonprofits, municipalities, other government agencies is they can receive up to $625,000 for the investigation, remediation, and any long-term maintenance of a site. That's $500,000, which we pay dollar for dollar. The next 125 is a 50 cent to the dollar match. For for-profit entities, our maximum is 200,000. 125 is dollar for dollar. The remaining 75 is 50 cents to the dollar. For affordable housing projects, which many of our nonprofits have done, Ministry of Caring, Habitat for Humanity, for LEEDS projects, energy efficient, and for any profit or nonprofit that qualifies as a small business, and there's a definition in the application, we will waive that 50 cent to the dollar match. So for any entity that falls in those categories, it would be a full maximum dollar for dollar match. Next slide. We've added in the last a little over a year some additional monies. There's an additional on top of that 625 or 200,000, an additional 65,000 where we can remove a source area. There's an additional 25,000 for offsite contamination. And again, the brownfield developer is not responsible for that offsite contamination, but if we think it may be going off-site, we will offer $25,000 that their consultant who's already on site could possibly use to drop, say, wells off-site so that we have that information. And we're giving incentives to do green remediation. There's an additional $25,000 if that remediation activity qualifies as a green remediation project. Next slide. So what it is, it's collaboration equals success, and that's collaboration. It's between DNREC and property owners. It's between DNREC and the brownfield developers. It's also between DNREC and the brownfield developer and maybe some other state government agencies where we can leverage money. So I've given the next few slides, I'm not going to go through them, but they are some additional resources that as a brownfield developer, I just try to collect information and pass it on. So next slide. The Brownfield Marketplace is a DNREC on our website. We host this. It is currently under renovation. So what's there right now is pretty sketchy. There will be a new Brownfield Marketplace website launched momentarily. On that site, there are sites that are already certified as a brownfield, a property owner that wants to market their property. They know it's not selling because it's contaminated. They can have their property certified and put it in this marketplace. So it's easier for potential buyers that are looking for a brownfield. There are also sites in there that have not, the owner has not given us an application and certified them, but they know they probably meet the criteria. So watch for that in the next, I would say, month or so. It's going to be a much fancier brownfield marketplace. Next slide. So documents, this is the web address, our application, our policy, what we pay for, and that legal agreement template are all available there. There's also a link to, you must have a certified consultant, and there is a link on this slide to make sure that you hire the correct consultant. Next slide. So we also have a Brownfield Revolving Loan Fund. If that 625 or 200,000 doesn't pay for the entire project, we do have this revolving loan fund, and there's a link there where you can read all of the caveats to that. Next slide. When it comes to what are typically referred to as petroleum brownfields, we do have two programs to assist with those sites. There's one called the First Fund Program, which if a site owner can prove they have the inability to pay, the state can step in and take out underground storage tanks and do some remediation. There's also money there for orphan tanks, which are ones where we find them on a site, there is no responsible party. There's also a heating fuel closure program for just heating fuel tanks less than 1,100 gallons. Both of these, again, money could be leveraged where brownfield money could be used in addition to these funds. If these programs are used without coming through brownfields, the difference is there's funding but no liability protection. So the only way to get liability protection for contamination existing on the site is to come through the brownfields program. But we can marry sometimes these two programs and offer a little more funding. Next slide. These are just resources. The Institute for Public Administration, Biden School at the University of Delaware, there is this Complete Communities Toolbox, which has some awesome information. They also host the Delaware database for funding resilient communities. And I put there the filters. That's how you can put in different criteria. If you are looking for a loan, a grant, this is a wonderful resource. Next slide. Again, these are just resources. This is the website for Delaware there's a whole bunch of different tax credit programs that exist that possibly, can be used to, again, leverage money. Next slide. In June of 2019, back when we could all still meet in person, we did, DNREC hosted a Brownfields Basics workshop, and the presentations that were made are listed there, and they are available on our website. The web address is there. Next slide. So there is not an email, I'm sorry, right at the moment as a contact, because like I said, I will be retiring next Thursday. But if you want additional information, if you call that main number and just tell them you want to speak to someone about brownfields, and until there is an actual human body and an email successor hired for my position, you will be forwarded to one of our program managers who can certainly answer any questions. So I will pass it over now to EPA. So you know now that DNREC can fund cleanup, investigation, and cleanup of a site. So there obviously are some other things that you might need funding for that are not covered by Delaware. And there are EPA grants that, again, can go beyond what DNREC can offer. And often, we can leverage grant from EPA and a grant from the Delaware Brownfields Program. So thank you very much, and I will turn it over to EPA.
Thanks, Jill. It looks like we do have one question quickly before we move into. So Becky, if you want to go ahead and ask.
Sure. Hi, Jill, and congratulations on your retirement next Thursday.
Thanks.
I'm Becky Harrington. I'm with the State of Delaware's Economic Development Public-Private Partnership, DPP. So don't come into contact too often with companies that are looking at specific sites that are brownfield, but I do have a question about the timing. If I heard you correctly, you said that it can take up to a year. So my question,
The entire process, which would be application, signing of the legal agreement, and then the consultant actually getting on site, what we call boots on the ground, punching the holes, taking the soil and groundwater samples, sending them to the lab, getting them back, having them do their report, giving it to DNREC reviewing the report, and then saying, this is what we do, then what we call a proposed plan and a final plan of remedial action. So yeah, it could, some of that obviously can take shorter or longer depending upon site specifics.
that's my question is that a protection? Is that what, and I understand making sure participants have realistic expectations, but what's the average, or is there an average? I mean,
I would say we do in the Brownfield Development Agreement. It now says that the Brownfield developer has 12 months from the date they sign the BDA for DNREC to get that report. So that we would expect to be the maximum, because that's what we put in the legal agreement. Again, based on site specifics, it doesn't mean you're thrown out of the program if it takes more than 12. It then is just, communication between DNREC, the consultant, and Brownfield developer to say, we need more time because X, Y, Z. So it certainly can take less.
okay. And that, my second question is it outlined anywhere, like the process in the application or information materials?
Yes, there is that flow chart that I had on the slide is a very truncated version. If you go to our website, that flow chart, technical track and legal track, there's a longer flow chart.
Okay. Super. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. If you have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat as we go. And if anything we don't get to, we'll try to answer in a frequently asked questions document and send it around after the webinar with the slides. All right. I think it's me next, right, Brittany?
Yes.
So again, my name is Carrie Staten and I'm with the WVU TAB program. So the Technical Assistance to Brownfields, or TAB program, is a program funded by the US EPA to provide technical assistance to communities and stakeholders to help on brownfield sites and to help increase your understanding of brownfield cleanup processes and assessment processes. This is completely funded by the EPA and it's available to everyone across the nation. There's a TAB provider for every EPA region. And so for Region 3, of which Delaware is a part, WVU is the new TAB provider. And all of these services are completely free to the users. So that's what EPA pays for. So if you have questions, there's no cost to you. You can reach out to us. Our key partners are the Brownfields Assistance Center at WVU, which I run, which has been providing technical assistance on brownfields to communities in West Virginia for 15 years. And we're excited to expand into the rest of Region 3. We're also partnering with our landscape architecture program to provide some design assistance and project specific assistance. And then you all met this morning, Christian Abilto from the School of Public Health, who's helping with our evaluation and also is going to help us with some case studies related to the health impacts of brownfields. So our focus for these TAB resources is around brownfield education. So things like today, where we're doing webinars and trainings to educate people on the different aspects of brownfields, both at the state and national level. Resource identification, so assistance with writing grants like the ones we're going to talk about this morning. Grant review once you're writing your grant, resource roadmaps, and a number of other things. We'll be doing some local brownfield program support, helping to identify brownfields and go through an inventory process, answering questions on specific sites, and doing a lot of different technical support And then also project development and design assistance, which is site specific and will be primarily through our Davis College Landscape Architecture program. The key part about these Brownfields resources is that they are responsive. So if you have a question and you're not sure where it lands, you can reach out to us directly, and we want to make sure that we get you to the right people to answer those questions. We are the new tab provider for Region 3. Previously, it was the New Jersey Institute of Technology. So our website is not yet live, but will be live next week. And in the meantime, you can reach out to me directly if you have any questions or need any support. And my email is going to be at the end of these slides, and you'll have that at the end of this session. Just some other quick technical assistance resources that are out there from EPA. Groundwork USA is another TA provider that can help with community engagement and environmental justice questions. They do a number of workshops and have a number of resources on their website. The Hazardous Materials Training and Research Institute has more technical resources related to specific hazardous materials. And the University of Louisville has created the Brownfields Areas Benefits Estimator tool that can help you look at different aspects of brownfield redevelopment as well. And all of those are links. And when you get these slides, you'll be able to click those to get directly to those resources as well.
This is me, right?
Yes.
Oh, good morning. Before I get started on the next slide, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Brittany Smith. I am with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Region 3. I am fairly new to the Brownfields program. I've been a project officer for a little over a year. But just as with Jill, you can't get attached to me too long because today is actually my last day in the Brownfields program. I'm getting ready to start a detail in another office. So I will introduce you to my replacement in a moment. I have a special place in my heart for Delaware, being that both of my parents met at Delaware State University. And then my sister and brother and I followed in their footsteps and graduated 20 years later. So I really want to see Delaware thrive and grow the way some of our other states do in the Brownfields program. So we want to bring this information to you to help you get a better understanding of what your options are through the federal government as well as through the state. So at this time, I will introduce Tony Geiger, who will be replacing me while I'm away on my detail. Tony?
Thanks, Brittany. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just got a new laptop, so I'm still, working on having Zoom talk to the right microphone and speakers on this computer. But yeah, I've been with EPA for a little over a year now, and I've been kind of diving in headlong to the Brownfields program over the past year. Like Brittany, I do have a special place in my heart for Delaware. My younger brother went to University of Delaware, so I made many visits across the Cape May Lewis ferry to go see him and spend some time. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you and having an open dialogue, and hopefully we'll all be in touch real soon.
Thanks, Tony. And Tony's email will be at the end of this presentation as well, if you want to reach out to him in the future. So I'll start on our slides. So we separated this form of Brownfields grant from the rest of our grants because this is a little outside of that grant process. The targeted Brownfields assessments, or TBAs, are given for site-specific sites within small communities, and they're typically for applicants who either never received a Brownfields grant or assistance grants from the federal government, or who were not awarded during the competitive grant process. So I think this is a good starting point for people who are just getting into Brownfields and have never managed a Brownfields grant before, especially on the federal level, because it can be a little intensive. So this is a good way to get your feet wet, and it is fully paid by EPA. And you just have to come in. It has to be something where it's a public or nonprofit property owner. It has to have concrete redevelopment plans, and more importantly, has to have overall public and nonprofit benefit. So this is a good way for you to apply. The process is a lot easier. I think it's about maybe like a 2 to 3 page application process. You can find all the information on EPA's website. This is an active link of how to apply at the bottom of this slide. So I highly recommend it just to get yourself started, or if you go out for the process and you do not receive an award. Next slide. So we're going to get started on the type of grants that EPA provides. We have assessment, cleanup, revolving loan fund, and job training. In other years, we have offered multi-purpose grants, as well as coalition grants under the assessment grants, but they change from year to year. So this year we'll be focusing on what is being offered through this solicitation for FY22. Next slide. So this is a diagram of how the Brownfields process works through EPA. I'm not going to go through each step, but it basically shows that you have to do an assessment, or an assessment has to be performed prior to the cleanup process. And that once you get to the cleanup process, you have to leverage resources and have, do the cleanup activities till you eventually get to redevelopment, which is obviously our overall goal. And if you see on the left-hand side, it says community involvement is involved through this entire process. And we can't stress that enough. If you're doing this for your community, they should be involved, throughout the planning, the implementation, and then, the benefits of your brownfields redevelopment. One important fact that we wanted to emphasize in this slide is that the third step, which is enter a Delaware Brownfields program, once you've started your phase 1 assessment, all the states have a voluntary Brownfields program, and Delaware's is a little different. So you have to make sure you enter into the Delaware Brownfields program. It's not the same as the volunteer programs as other states. But all that information, again, can be found on our websites, and I recommend contacting DEMREC for those specific activities. Next slide. So these are the three assessment grants that we are offering this year: site-specific, community-wide, and state and tribal, which is new for this year. The grant funding amounts are different as well for this year, so you have to look and see which one is the right fit for your project. And you can get more information on the website for each grant, because the guidelines and the requirements are different for each grant. Next slide. So again, for our assessment grants this year, we have site-specific, community-wide, and state and tribal. Hazardous and petroleum are combined. In past years, they've been separate. So you do not have to do separate activities for each of those substances. These are referred to as our Section 104K funding that is in association with the CERCLA regulation. So for the assessment grants, this is a grant where you can go in and provide or find out what brownfields are in your region and create a brownfields inventory. It's used for planning and doing phase 1 and phase 2 environmental assessments, and as well as community outreach. Next slide. This is a list of the eligible entities for assessment grants. I won't go through each of them, but it's mostly for, the most important thing to remember is not for private entities, but everyone else outside of your public or state and local are eligible entities. And applicants may submit up to 1 cleanup grant for each cycle. And the most important thing is that in all appropriate inquiry, which is essentially a phase 1, must be done in order to do a cleanup grant. It's similar to what Jill was stating for Delaware's regulation, where the applicant must be the owner and they must have done their due diligence ahead of time, or they will be considered the liable entity for the property or for the contamination if they don't do everything ahead of time. I believe in the next slide, Carrie, it has to be done 180 days prior to the property transfer. So just make sure that if you are coming in for a cleanup grant, that you've done your due diligence ahead of time, because if not, you will also be disqualified from being able to apply for a cleanup grant. Next slide. Now, this is another slide on cleanup grants. It has more specific information on what some of the activities are in terms of program reporting and cleanup oversight and environmental monitoring. You can get up to $500,000 per grant with a waiver of up to $650,000 per site. And it's a 3-year project period. And one important note for cleanup grants is that it does require a 20% cost share. Next slide. We also have a revolving loan fund program that capitalizes on a revolving loan fund for a community or eligible entity. It provides loans and sub-grants to carry out cleanup of brownfield sites. This also requires a 20% cost share, but it has up to $1 million per eligible entity. But this says is over a 5-year period versus a 3-year period. And you can apply as an individual entity or as part of an RLF coalition. And for more information on that, we have an RLF lead. His name is Brett Gilmartin, and I can provide his information, his email in the chat once I'm done my presentation, so that if you have any questions specifically about the RLF funds, you can reach out to him directly. Next slide. There are 2 changes of note for this year for RLF, and that is that only entities that do not currently have an open Brownfields RLF cooperative agreement are eligible to apply this year. And then for the high performing RLF recipients, instead of granting a supplement, they will consider giving a new award versus the supplement instead of extending the performance period. Our final grant is the job training grant. If the name changed, it was a much longer name before, like environmental workforce development and job trainings, and now they just cut it to job training, which sounds much more simple to me. And it's going to focus on specifically training individuals in HAZWOPER, OSHA, and health and safety, specific environmental cleanup skills. So the eligible entities are government entities, government related and nonprofit. The grants are up to $200,000. This year's grant application process or period has already closed, but this is something to keep in mind for next year. If you have a community that is struggling with unemployment, and then you are also considering doing some brownfields work, this is a great opportunity to come in for, you come in for an assessment or a cleanup grant, and then as well as having the job training grant to train and educate the local residents and eventually have them be hired as the individuals who are going to do this work and implement some of these cleanup processes and activities. Next slide. In Delaware, one of our successful job training grantees is the West End Neighborhood House in Wilmington. They came in for a grant, I believe in FY18, and in FY20, they've graduated 41 individuals through their job training program. And as you can see in this list, these are the different things that they were trained in, and I don't believe they are trained in all of those things, but I think depending on, what the focus is, each program is different. But it's a good opportunity to, increase employment in areas that are suffering from unemployment and are looking to do some brownfields work. Next slide. So now we're going to try to share some of the tips and tricks for application details regarding the application process itself, as well as what to look for in how your application will be evaluated to make sure you can get the highest score possible. So the solicitation for this year for FY22 just came out this past Tuesday. That includes all the new guidelines that can help you put together your application to make sure that you are addressing each requirement. And it has been posted in several places, including grants.gov, as well as EPA's Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization website. And both of these are active links here that you can use once you receive the presentation. The applications are due December 1st, and they are very strict about these deadlines. There's no wiggle room, there's no exceptions. So if you are looking to apply for one of these grants, I recommend that you start now, getting your things together, and Carrie will give you some instructions on some of the things you need to get started on ASAP. The rest of the timeline is tentative. They're still determining what some of the exact dates are, but the threshold criteria reviews will be once all the applications are in, they'll begin in December through January. From January to February, Region 3 will discuss their applications on nationwide panels. And the way the panels are set up is that there are 2 individuals from Region 3. One will be from the Brownfields office and will be one of the project officers. And another person will be someone who was outside of Brownfields to kind of give a third review that is unbiased and kind of, just looking at things from a different perspective. And then the second person that will be on the review panel is someone from another region who was in the Brownfields program. And then in May, between May and June, I think will be the grant selection announcements. Things have been pushed back a lot compared to other years. So again, that information will be updated on the website as they make decisions on when these things will occur. Next slide. I think it's you now, Carrie.
All right. So I want to take a quick minute to talk about how you get ready to be able to even apply before we talk about the content. So as Brittany said, all of the applications have to be submitted through grants.gov, which is the federal clearinghouse for all funding opportunities through EPA and other agencies. And in order to have an account on grants.gov that you can use to submit grants, you have to first be registered in the sam.gov system, which is the system for award management. And this is an official website of the government. There's no cost to use it. You use it completely for free to register to do business with the government. And by doing business, they include any sort of grant. If you're a grant recipient, you do need to be registered in here. You can check the status of your registration at sam.gov and look for other registrants as well. So you may already have this if your organization or your municipality has ever applied for federal funding, not just from the EPA in the past. You may already have an account. And the folks to check with would be the leadership of your organization, your city or county clerk, your city manager, or if you have a grant writer or grant manager. You can check the status and apply for a sam.gov account at sam.gov. You're going to need your DUNS number, your tax identification number, and your bank information in order to get all set up in this account or in the system. This process is not immediate. So that's why I want to make sure we talk about it now. It can take 2 to 3 weeks from the day that you submit all this information on sam.gov for you to be certified and get all of your information and account set up properly. So it is not something that you want to leave until the last minute. So you want to make sure that you are ready to go. And this is something that I can help you with through the TAB services if you have questions or if you're trying to figure it out. You do have to renew and update your sam.gov information every 12 months. So even if you're sure you have an account set up already, make sure that you go check and see when the expiration date is. And if it's anywhere near December 1st, I would say go ahead and renew it so that you don't have any qualms or issues right at the deadline time. You want to make sure that the contact information in that account is up to date. If people have left and you have new employees who may be doing that, you want to make sure you can get that going. And like I said, if there are any issues, you want to know now and not on November 28th, because there's not going to be a lot that can be done then. It is free to register and renew, but once you're in the system, you may start getting emails that look very official and offer to renew your registration for the small fee of $300 or $100, whatever. All of these are scams. It does not cost you anything to renew. So definitely, if you get an email that looks official but asks you to pay something from sam.gov, check it out and reach out and we can help you do that without getting into a scam. All right, I think, Brittany, before we get into the nitty gritty of the applications, I have a couple of just review questions for folks to see what we've already learned, just 2 really quickly. So the first one I'm going to launch right now is a true or false question about the targeted brownfields assessment. So the targeted brownfield assessment services are provided only with a required 50% cost share. Is that true or false? Go ahead and answer that. I'll give you a second. Brittany talked about this at the very beginning. I'll give folks another minute to answer. All right, you got about 20 seconds, so get your answer in. I'm sorry that we're not in person. I might have some fun candy prizes or something for the right answer, but I can't toss candy through the screen, unfortunately. If only we could figure out that technology. All right, I'm going to close it and share our results. All right, about a third of you said true, another 2/3 said false. Brittany, what's the answer?
The answer is false.
Right. The TBAs are completely free. You do have to apply through a much easier process than what we're about to talk about for the big grants, but it is completely a free service from EPA.
And none of our grants require 50% cost share.
Correct.
20% is the number.
Correct. All right. I think we will save the others for in just a bit.
Okay. So now we're going to move on to the application process. There's no questions.
Long
Okay.
slide, so there you go.
So the application requirements, these are some of the main requirements for when you submit your application. There are a bunch of other forms and documents that you will have to submit, but all those templates and resources on how to fill those out and what you need to do are again located on the website. But you need to complete a threshold criteria, and that determines the eligible entities and sites, and that's reviewed prior to anything else you submit regarding your narrative in your application. So someone separate will review your threshold criteria to make sure you are indeed eligible to receive a grant prior to your the application being sent out to a panel for review. For cleanup grants specifically, you have to submit your community notifications and public meetings, just to ensure that you are including the community in your planning process and as part of this grant. Your narrative information sheet will basically be a 1 to 2 pager that has your basic information regarding your organization or your entity, your community, and some of the information about what you're planning to do. You will need a letter from the state environmental authority that is in support of your plan for your brownfield redevelopment and in terms of this grant. And then obviously the bigger portion or the meat of everything is the actual narrative itself that you will be evaluated on to determine if you're going to receive the grant or not. Next slide. So next we're going to go through the 4 parts of the narrative criteria, which is the project area description and plans for revitalization. Part 2 is community need and community engagement. Part 3 is task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. And part 4 is programmatic capability and past performance. Next slide. So here are some of the main tips that I wanted to impart before we get into what each section is. As I mentioned, I'm new to the Brownfields program, so I've only been through the process of doing the evaluations on a panel one time, but just from that experience, I thought that there are some tips that potential grantees or applicants should know going forward. And that is number 1, to be clear, concise, and factual and provide sufficient detail. You can't go into anything assuming that people know things. Like we don't know anything about your community. Definitely assume that the person that is on the panel from another region knows nothing about the state of West Virginia or nothing about the state of Delaware. They don't know anything about the communities or Delaware's culture or their economic standing. So try to be as concise as possible. I hate to use the term dumb it down, but make sure that you are being very descriptive about your site and about your community and what your plans are and how you will benefit from this Brownfields grant. A response in one criteria or sub-criteria that is included in a different section of a narrative may not be scored favorably. So there are certain sections in the criteria rubric that we use that state specifically that something has to be, a specific fact or something has to be stated in this section. So regardless if you stated it in the very beginning in the project description or the area description, if you didn't restate it down in that section, which it would say in the guidelines, we can't score you for that. which, going through it for my first time was a shocker for me because, as your home region, we are fighting for you to get the grant. We're fighting for all of our home region grantees or applicants to get these grants, but so are the other regional panel members fighting for their grants as well. So they tend to be the harsher reviewers on our home grants. So you have to make sure that, you give us the tools that we need so that we can fight for your grant. So you have to make sure you address each thing that is requested for each criteria. If they're requesting a specific information, make sure it's in there, even if you said it once, even if you said it 3 times by the time you got to this section, say it again. And make sure that you include the criteria number and title in your responses so that we know that you are answering this specific criteria with your describing. Carrie, I know you said, before we go to the next slide, I know you said you may have had a tip or two. If you wanted to jump in and say anything for this slide, feel free.
Sure. Yeah, I think I would reiterate what Brittany's saying is that you may have written other grants in your life that they just want to have the information and they don't really care what order it is in, as long as they're getting the full picture. That is not the case for EPA grants. They want you to answer the questions in the order they give them to you, and they want the answers where they ask for them. So that is a crucial piece. The other thing I would say is that at the end of the guidelines, when you get into them, you'll see that they have those rubrics for how they're being evaluated by each section, and it tells you how many points each section is worth. And I find that really helpful to know how much information you should be giving, right? So when you only have 10 pages for the entire thing. So when you're reviewing and you are trying to figure out where to put the meat of your response, if a question is worth 5 points, you don't want to give it as much space as a question that's worth 15 or 20 points, right? So you want to make sure that you're getting that information in the right places and that you're stressing the things that are worth the most points. And while this may be difficult, you do still want to tell the story. It just may be a little more truncated. It may not be in the order that you would write it if you just sat down to write the story of your community, but you want to make sure it's coming through while also hitting exactly the questions that EPA is asking you.
And again, if you need help with that, Carrie and her team are there to help you with that. They can review your grant, your narrative, and just make sure that you're on the right track. Now that the solicitation is out, EPA can't necessarily help you with just like, we can't look at your application from this point on, but Carrie and her team are there for that, and some of the other resources that were mentioned in this presentation. So please use the resources that are there for you, especially because they're free. Next slide. So part 1 is the project area description and plans for revitalization. They are broken up into 2 or 3 different sections in the rubric that we go through for scoring. So make sure you address each sub-criterion within each criteria. Give as much detail about your community as you can. Go back through historical records to describe how a site got to be where it is today, especially if it's a severely contaminated site and it could have a history of having several different businesses at that one site. And that's why it is the way it is, and it's causing issues for the community. But one of a big important thing is, and I think going forward it's always been important for brownfields, but I think with the climate of how things are, especially politically, and when it comes to funds, we want to make sure that the funds that we are providing to communities are actually coming to fruition for something that is going to be a benefit to the community. So you need to have a strong revitalization plan, plans that align with an existing community revitalization plan and how they match up perfectly like puzzle pieces, so that we can see a big picture. So make sure you give good details and have a strong plan for how you are trying to revitalize your community, specifically in terms of stimulating the economy, increasing jobs, and things that are going to increase the overall well-being of the current residents. Next slide. So part 2 is community need and community engagement. As I stated before, you have to show that community is involved in this process and you're not doing it in a silo or unilaterally, and the community has no input. So you have to, one thing, and I think some of this is the meat of the narrative, is to show why your community really needs this funding. You need to remember you're competing with people from communities from across the nation. So why does your community need this funding more than, or just as much as the communities that are going to be chosen? Focus on the need for funding in terms of if you're a small or low income community. You've had a lot of small towns and communities who have lost a lot of their residents due to unemployment, and now their tax revenue is much lower, so they don't have the funds to be able to do any of these projects. Connect all of those dots and tell the story of why your community can't afford to do these types of activities on their own, and you need EPA funding. And also stress the threats to sensitive populations. If you have a significant population of elderly, or you have a lot of children, and or you have a specific ethnic community that is, that tends to be grouped in an area that's surrounded by brownfields, or even like back to the elderly. If you have several brownfields sites in your community or around your community, and they're contributing to, increased levels of, or instances of cancer or asthma, make those connections and paint the picture of how these brownfields that are present year after year are making things worse for your community, and you need, the assistance. And regarding community engagement, make sure you have a clear list of partners and how they are going to be participating in the grant implementation from beginning to end. I think one of the important things that I noticed through the panel reviews was that if it's better for you to have a diverse group of project partners that'll help your score. So instead of just having government partners or that are specifically just in government, it helps to have a local church community group in your as part of your partners, or someone from the health organization in your area. Those types of partners that can help speak on behalf of different communities, and make sure that everyone is represented in your community, help to strengthen your proposal. And then also make sure you have a plan, or how you're going to get community input, and how you're going to incorporate that into your plan moving forward. And how you're going to communicate the results and the progress of your project with the community as you proceed through your grant. Next slide. Do you have any questions? Do you want to do another poll, Carrie?
Yeah, while you're thinking about your good questions about the first half of the guidelines, I'm going to pop up a couple of quick polls, but you can drop your questions in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and I'll call on you like we did with Becky a few minutes ago. So the next poll question is true or false again. EPA assessment grants can be provided for brownfield inventories, planning, environmental assessment, community outreach for specific sites, entire communities, and or states or tribal lands. So take a second and answer that question. And in the meantime, think about some questions that you might have. So the first two parts that I'll vamp a little bit. The first two parts that we've talked about so far are really where you're starting to tell your story. And you also want to weave in some demographic data and information about your community to try to really paint that picture for what is the space, what is your area like, what is this project area like, and what is the potential impact that a grant is going to have. So these are important sections to really start to lay the framework for the rest of your proposal. And as I recall, are worth a good chunk of points. So you definitely want to make sure that you're answering those questions fully. Not getting many poll responses, you guys. I'm going to give you about 30 more seconds to answer this question. If you're not sure of the answer, take a guess. We're going to tell you the right answer in just a second. So
Carrie, I don't know if this was true for everyone, but I was having issues. The poll screen you popped up was like the results screen, and I didn't have an option to check an
thanks
answer.
for that. You are correct. Let's try this again. There we go. Thanks, Tony. That's working. Or just a test to make sure you're really paying attention or that I'm really paying attention. All right, we'll take another couple of seconds. People are taking good notes, I can tell, based on the responses. All right. That was true. Grants can be used for inventories, planning, assessments, and community outreach. You'll see a lot of the assessment grants are used for primarily environmental assessments, and you will likely spend most of your budget on that, but you are able to do some planning activities, and there's some links at the end of these slides that give you a better idea of what those different planning activities are. So excellent. Nice work, you guys. Let's do one more about cleanup grants. True or false again, EPA cleanup grants can be provided to entities that do not own the property at the time of application. A couple seconds. I'm still not seeing any questions in the chat or any hands raised. So once we finish this question, we will move on to the next section. All right. So this question, some clarification. This is false. EPA cleanup grants can only be provided to entities that own the property when they apply, and you must have done your all appropriate inquiry, which is essentially a phase one within 180 days before taking ownership of the property. So you couldn't have owned it for a long time and just now be ready to clean it up, as long as when you took ownership, you did that all appropriate inquiry in the right time frame. So, all right, on to the next section. All right. So part 3 is the project implementation, or the task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring your progress. This is where you're really going to lay out what your activities are, both for the cleanup grant and the assessment grant. So you're going to list and describe your tasks, what your anticipated schedule is, who's going to lead each of those tasks, and what your expected outputs are. You're going to also include your cost estimates, and there is a recommended format for your budget that we'll show you in a minute, and that is included in the guidelines. And I strongly recommend that you use that format, because all the reviewers are going to be used to it, so it's going to be easier for them to evaluate it as they're going through. And then you want to describe how each cost estimate for the task was developed per the budget category. It's important here to remember for a cleanup grant that you will have also done an analysis of brownfield cleanup activities, which I don't think we talked about very much at the beginning of the slides, but this is something that is required as part of your threshold and attachments that shows what several options of cleanup were and what the costs were, what the benefits were of each of them, and then ultimately which one you're going to include. You will want to pull information from that document into the guidelines. You don't have to pull the whole thing because it'll probably be way too long, but it's important to remember that when the reviewers are looking at your narrative answers, they are not looking at that ABCA. So they're only going to see the information that is in this narrative. So you want to make sure that you've pulled the relevant information out of that ABCA so that it can be evaluated properly. And then you're also going to talk about how you plan to measure and track your environmental results and evaluate your progress throughout the project. So here is a budget example. That budget table at the bottom is what you'll see a version of in the guidelines, and you want to make sure that you're using that with your tasks divided, and it will give you all of the lines that EPA is looking for. There may be additional budget categories. This is just sort of a short version. And then at the top, you see an example of the task description. So you see it doesn't have to be very long. It doesn't have to be in a sort of traditional narrative sentence structure because you want to make sure you're making the most of the space you have on the page, but it does break down how much what you're doing. So this is from an assessment grant. You're saying that your in-kind labor is valued at an hourly rate and how many hours and how many months that staff is going to do that. And then you're doing 10 phase 1 environmental site assessments, which are estimated to cost $3,500 a piece, which comes to $35,000, and so on with the different components. And then for a cleanup and redevelopment planning, you can see a similar breakdown of staff time and then the cost of the contractual pieces like an ABCA or a site reuse and marketing plan. All right, the last section is the programmatic capability section. It has 3 components: the organizational structure, which just goes over how your team is structured to make sure that the grant is carried out successfully. So will you have a project manager? Who's going to manage the day-to-day? What about your planned consultant team? And who's going to be responsible for what? Describe those key staff that are going to work together to implement the grant, and then how you will acquire additional resources if those are necessary and haven't already been identified. So in the past performance and accomplishment section, you're going to answer one of 3 possible questions. Option 1 is that you have received a US EPA Brownfield grant before. Option 2 is that you have not received an EPA grant before, but you have received some other kind of grant. Could be federal, could be a philanthropy from a foundation, could be a different state agency. And the third option is that you have never received any grant before. So you only have to answer one of these, but when you're, as Brittany said, you want to put in your application which question you're responding to. So make sure you pull that out. If you have never received a grant before, my recommendation would be not to start with an EPA assessment or cleanup grant. If you know you need an assessment, but you've never managed a grant, it would, as Brittany said at the beginning, a TBA, Targeted Brownfields Assessment Grant, is a much easier place to start and can help you build that experience. And also, if you do answer in that, you'll get a neutral number of points, which may impact how competitive your grant is, frankly. These are incredibly competitive grants, so you want to make sure that you're answering to the best of your ability and maximizing your chances there. And when you're thinking about non-federal grant experience, think about different kind of funding you've got. You may not have framed it as a grant in your mind, but if you've gotten funding from outside organizations that you've successfully managed, then that's what they want to hear about. And if you're not sure about that, that's another thing that we can help you with at TAB kind of think through. So when you're describing your other grant experience, you're going to talk about who were your project partners and what were their roles, and how did you incorporate that community input and communication, or that seems like it may be on the wrong slide. You want to talk about what were the accomplishments, how did you accomplish them, did you meet everything on time, and if you didn't, how did you handle that? So, things happen on grants. We all know that, especially after the last 2 years. So if things didn't go to plan, were you communicating with your project officer? And how did you adjust to make sure that you still met your deliverables? So as Brittany said, these grants just came out a couple of days ago, and EPA is planning to hold some more in-depth webinars on the grants. They're going to have one on October 13th that's going to focus on the community assessment and site-specific assessment grants, the cleanup grants, and the RLF funding. Those are all grants that are open to any non-private organization. So those are the grants that are most widely accessible. On the 14th, they're going to have a webinar specifically discussing these new community-wide assessment grants for states and tribes, and only states and tribes are eligible for that. So that's a much smaller pool of applicants. The national TAB provider, Kansas State University, is also planning to have a webinar after these, but the date has not yet been set. Once that is set, I will be sure to send it out to everyone on this list, because it's likely that they'll go into a little bit more detail, both on this EPA webinar on the 13th and on that KSU grant, because the guidelines will have been out a little longer and they'll be able to dive into it more. So I definitely recommend that you check one or both of those out as well. All right, any questions about the last 2 sections of the grant? Or anything that's come up since we started? All right, I have a question, Brittany, to clarify for everyone, and then we do have another poll, and if anybody else has questions, please start typing them in. So I remember that we talked about you can only apply for one cleanup grant at a time. Can you apply for a cleanup grant and an assessment grant at the same time?
Well, that is a good question, and it's not necessarily one I have the answer to. Tony, do you have any information on this question? I can't see. I would think it'd be hard, but I can't see that, especially if it's for the same. If the cleanup grant is for one of the same sites as the assessment grants, no. But I don't see why you wouldn't be.
In
able
the
to.
past, it has been possible. So I think if it was a change, I will check on this and put it in the frequently asked questions. I just didn't have time to dive in to find that. In the past, it was possible. So like we've seen some pretty high capacity development authorities that are cleaning up properties, but also assessing at the same time. So maybe with a past assessment, they found a site that needed cleanup, they took ownership, and now they're ready to clean it up, but they also need more assessment money to do other sites. Again, if you're just getting started with EPA grants, I would not recommend doing two at the same time. But we will clarify that for sure in our follow-up with you guys to make sure that that has not changed, unless Tony knows the answer off the top of his head.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I believe that's accurate.
Yeah.
Everything you just said. But I have a question too, Carrie. What would you recommend for entities that do not have prior grant experience to write in their programmatic capability section?
I think for sure, you want to make sure you answer it. So you don't want to just say that's the one you're answering and not answer it. And that would be true throughout. If there's anything that is not applicable or something, you always want to make sure you say that explicitly. I think what I would say is just say that you don't have any past experience, and maybe if there is other experience that might demonstrate your capacity in other ways, you could include that. But I do believe that regardless that you get a neutral score on that, if you choose that option, you get a neutral score, is the most you can get. Is that right, Brittany?
Yeah, it sounds about right.
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
Mhm. I mean, it might, like you said, it might help in another area if you say you've never managed a grant before, but you just had an experienced grant manager join, your office, in your community that would help you, in the capability section. But yeah, you will get a neutral score regardless if you've never managed a grant. But like Carrie said, try to think outside the box. If you got money from somewhere and you had to manage it, that may not have been. It could have been a donation, but you still had to manage the funds correctly for whatever the purpose was. So just put something like that in there.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the way to go. And even if you have not closed a grant, if you are currently managing a grant, then you should answer that you are managing a grant. So it's okay that it's still ongoing. You just want to talk about that it's going well and that you are meeting requirements. So yeah, you do want to make sure that you are answering that as best you can. All right. While we're thinking of other questions, I'm going to launch our last two poll questions, our last two quiz questions. We do have some post questions as we end. But this question is true or false once more. EPA cleanup grants require a 20% cost share. Give you a couple more seconds. We got quick answers on that one. All right. Excellent job, everyone. That is true. However, it does not have to be cash, right, Brittany? It can be also in-kind cost share. I would not recommend that it is all in-kind cost share because you want to make sure that you are also showing some cash just to make a more competitive grant. But you can include some, like I've seen watershed groups apply for cleanup grants who have an all volunteer staff and use their staff time as an in-kind cost share. And if you're not sure how to value that, there's an organization called Independent Sector that values volunteer time. They update it every year, and you can see what the national volunteer sort of industry accepted rate for volunteer time is. And you can also drill down to see what it is in your state, so you can get it straight for Delaware. And that's a resource that I can share with you as a follow-up as well. All right. One last question. Which of the following grants were not discussed during today's training? What did we not hear about today? And once you answer that, think about your last questions. We have a couple more slides of other resources and things coming up to help you. But we want to make sure that we're getting all of these questions about these grants in particular, because that is our main goal today. All right. Great job, you guys. We did not talk about Superfund, and I'm not going to talk about it now to further confuse you. But if you want to know more about Superfund, you can look those up on the EPA website as well. All right. So I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to dive into our other quick resources. There's just some additional resources that can be helpful as you're writing these grants. So at the EPA website, listed there, you can see all the different kinds of grant funding, and it'll link you to all of the new guidelines from there. You can also, there's some great resources on what are the eligible planning activities for under assessment grants that we talked about, things like planning for your site reuse plan, site disposition studies, etc. And they've got some great one-pagers from EPA on what each of those activities might look like, and you can use that to see what you might want to do and help weave that into your narrative. And then there's another great resource at the EPA site on common environmental contaminants and health impacts. And I find this really helpful when I'm writing, if I'm not immediately familiar with a contaminant, to see what are its potential health impacts, and then kind of looking at data that's comparable and talking about how that cleaning up that contaminant is going to have a positive impact on a community. And then just some other tools. There's the EJ Screen tool is a map that can help you look at different environmental sites and things in a community that you can talk about when you're discussing the environmental justice section, and as well, and you can also use the Enviro Atlas map for those resources. And then the Census Bureau is where you're going to be able to find some good demographic information to help tell the story of your community, to talk about poverty rates, to talk about employment rates, and all of that, all of those relevant pieces of information at the beginning of your story when you're talking about your community and your target area.
And Carrie, I just want to jump in for a second. I did take a quick look at the guidelines yesterday, and I did see us for the community section. They are highly recommending that you use data from EJ Screen. And so if you have that referenced in your proposal, that'll definitely help you get some top marks versus not using it.
Yeah, and you want to make sure that you are using data and statistics and talking about where you get it when you talk about it. So if you talk about, we're an environmental justice community, but you don't talk about why you think that is true or what the demographics are, then that's not going to be reviewed as favorably as if you've really backed it up. So that's important. So as we've said, WVU TAB can help you. We can specifically help on grant support by reviewing your grants and providing feedback on how you can improve. We can answer your questions and clarify all the different sections or eligibility. We can do some data gathering help. We can help you navigate those resources that we listed on the previous slide. And then of course we can help with SAM.gov and grants.gov assistance, as long as you get that done soon, because you want to make sure that you've got that all in place. And so I'm gonna hand it over to Brittany. You're muted.
Sorry, this is just an upcoming training that's being offered next week through the Smart Growth organization who's also an organization that does a lot of brownfields work through webinars and education. So if you are just curious to see what other communities are doing, I believe that this is focused, it says this is session 3, so the 2 sessions that have occurred before, I think they're doing this in conjunction with Region 5, which is in Chicago. So it might just help to see what other communities are doing if you're trying to figure out where to start, or what are some things that you can do under an assessment or cleanup grant. So the more information you can hear about, the better. So the link below will take you where to register for the webinar. And I encourage you to just take a look. The next slide. And this is just a toolkit that EPA offers. You can find it on EPA's website. And it's just, some tools that can that can help you figure out how to reuse sites and to leverage resources. I mean, just different things that can help you with your grant and figure out what you want to do in terms of planning for your community. Next slide. We also have the 2021 Brownfields National Conference coming up in December, from December 8th to the 11th in Oklahoma City. If it's another way to learn, there will be several workshops and sessions that talk about an array of different things that are all encompassing of brownfields. So even if you don't come out for one this year, you know, it might be good for you to attend this conference. I believe registration is still open. It's in person right now. I think they're trying to figure out, you know, and weigh what's going on with the pandemic, whether they're going to make it virtual or just reschedule it. But I would take a look, at least just to look and see what sessions are being offered. If they are of any interest, it might be of any help to you. And again, the link is below to access the information.
There's the contact information for all of us. And if you would, before you log off, just take a second to answer the poll questions that are in front of you. This just gives us a good sense of how this went today and what other information we can share with you. And I will stick around for a couple minutes if you have any other questions or you want to chat about any sections. But other than that, I think we're all set. Thanks to DNRAC and Region 3, Brittany and Tony and Jill for helping put this together and going over this with us today. And thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
And please feel free to share the presentation with other interested parties or anyone you think may benefit from brownfields redevelopment. We try to reach as many people as possible, but we know everybody can't attend everything. So if you know someone or another community or organization that may benefit, please share, spread the word. And thank you, Carrie, for putting all this together and slides and back and forth and the poll questions. And thank everyone else at WVU for helping with everything.
Thanks. And we will send out these slides and the link as well as some frequently asked questions, probably early next week once we have a chance to get it all gathered together. And then I think we will have it posted on our website once it is live next week. And I think DNRAC was going to try to post it. Is that